to get somewhere, because there's always somebody that can help you with that.
Yeah.
And you just have to know yourself that you either need the help or you start trial and error, change things, see if it makes a difference. Mm-hmm. What are the things? So everything is connected. So that's too much. That's too much to take on board. So what do you narrow it down to? I think the easiest way to think about it is the way we've been talking about it, which is like the foundation of your health comes from nutrition. If something's wrong in your health, that's where you should start. That's the major difference between, it's not that you only do that, but you start there. That's the major difference between medical thinking and natural health or nutrition thinking. It's like you start with the foundation because that makes the most sense. And even if you just use the house analogy, like if you can't do anything if you haven't got the foundation.
Yeah.
And so it's like you don't have to know what the foundation is, but I'll tell you what it is. It's quite simple. It's quite simple to get the basics right. It's nutrient density, and it's not eating foods that cause your body any trouble. How you figure out what they are is you, at this stage of the game, you go into ChatGPT and you say, what are the nutrient dense foods? And you'll know in a minute. How do you figure out what foods are causing your body aggravation? You tune into yourself and you see what happens to your body when you eat certain foods and when you stop eating certain foods. And if you haven't a clue where to start, just get someone to help you. Get a nutritionist and they'll help you. There's standard ones like gluten, dairy, like gluten in wheat and grains in general maybe, and dairy. But there's junk food. I even have gone, at this stage, the idea that you have to tell someone that certain food is junk still blows my mind. That some people don't know. They just don't know. There is one junk food, I'll talk about that in a second. There's one junk food that no one knows about. But like general junk, if you're eating like a sweet, like a bar, let's say, or a scone every day, that's a problem. Like, it's not a problem to eat the bar or the scone. It's a problem to eat it every day. Yeah. And because it's going to do something to your blood sugar, it's going to cause some inflammation if you're intolerant to it. And you probably are, because it's modern processed food. It's going to cause an intolerance in your body. You're going to struggle to digest it. It's going to cause inflammation at some small level, but it's every day is the problem. And of course, that doesn't mean there's no such thing as treats. There is treats. It's just like get nutrient-dense treats. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So they're not as nice, no, because they're not like flooding your brain with sudden, beautiful, cocaine-like energy. You can, there's still nice foods you can eat that are nutrient-dense. So like, to me, the nutrient-dense foods are like animal foods, meat, fish, dairy, shellfish. Now, I said dairy, and I just mentioned that dairy is a common intolerance. It's still a nutrient-dense food, though. Yeah. And everyone isn't intolerant to it. A significant portion are.
And in a lot of the ancestral diets, you find a lot of dairy food as well.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And actually, that was the whole idea of fermented dairy foods. That all came from the traditional societies who wanted to preserve the seasons, essentially. They essentially wanted to preserve the sunlight in food for the next season when you couldn't grow it. That was where fermenting and preservations came from. So that is a form of processing, but it's not like modern processing. But yeah, it's the nutrient-dense foods. Like my father, God rest him, used to eat packet and tripe. I never liked the smell of it. I've never eaten it, but it's a nutrient-dense food. It's sheep's stomach and kidneys or something. But that whole awful thing fell out of favour fairly quickly. And I think the one that's left, that very few people eat, but it's still there, is liver. It's like lamb's liver. It's a bit nicer than the beef liver, but lamb's liver is actually so nutrient-dense that if you ate it every day, you'd cause an excess imbalance in your system. And it's like, that's probably that might be the only food that you can do that with. Cause yourself to have, what's the word, not deficiency syndromes, but like excess syndromes. What's the phrase I'm looking for there? I don't know.
Toxicity?
Kind of a toxicity of of vitamin A or something in particular in that one. But yeah, so the nutrient-dense foods, first of all, are the organ meats. How I get around that with clients is if they don't want to eat them, take them in capsules. Dried liver or something like that is the handiest way to take it. They're so good. They're dear, but they're so good. Mm-hmm. There's no easy way out of it. Like you have to either buy the foods or you have to buy some supplements to help you kind of catch up, so to speak.
And supplements, you can't supplement your way out of a crap diet.
No, you can't.
In other words, but when we say supplements, we're talking about something that fills a gap. Yeah. It's there. It's not for life. It's supplemental to a good, whole food, nutritious diet. know?
That's exactly what it is. I tend to think of it in, if you think of optimal nutrition, that concept, which is, I mentioned earlier about the food pyramid and all that, and the government's setup. It's like, that's adequate nutrition. It's adequate. They even have like adequate daily amounts. They even have names like that for adequate allowances or whatever. It's adequate to tell a population to eat that way so they don't die from starvation or they don't get scurvy. So, but the optimal, that's the bit that's on you, as I say. The way I kind of look at that is, we can lament the loss of the traditional sort of farming systems. We have industrial farming. We eat food from all around the world. We process food. We've lost a certain. Food, in fact, food alone has lost its nutrient density. Right? So it's harder to eat a nutrient-dense diet now than it used to be.
Well, if we pause there for a second and we explain why that might be so, we're looking at, levels of minerals within the ground, for instance. So because of monocrop, like massive, how many thousands of hectares of wheat, we'll say, grown in certain parts of the States or wherever, of one crop year after year, stripping the nutrients from the soil. So we're talking about literally starting from a nutrient deplete soil.
Yeah, there's actually some very interesting research on that as I was writing the book. It was a challenge to that idea. It was like, and I think it was mostly based in America, because it seems to be where the biggest problems are. It was, the idea was, actually, if you measure the soil, the minerals are there still, but actually what's not there is the mycorrhiza and the fungal ecosystem that connects the minerals to the plants.
Okay, this is an area then that I've recently been looking into.
Okay.
Yeah, another couple of practitioners that are talking about this.
Oh, right, okay.
Idea that if you put the nutrients required on one section of the land, they actually can make their way throughout the rest of that land.
Through the fungal system.
Through the fungal system. Yeah.
That's kind of mental. I'm gonna hypothesize here for a minute. Who's the guy you sent me?
Zach.
Oh, Zach Bush.
Bush.
Oh, yeah. Zach Bush, yeah.
That's who I'm thinking of. So, yeah, the same practitioner I was talking about was Zach Bush. Some of his podcasts have been fantastic.
Zach talks about this a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, it may well have been him that alerted me to this publication. He didn't do it, but he alerted me to it. I think it was, actually. But I took some hope from that idea, actually, that... Oh yeah, I was hypothesizing just before that. That idea that kind of underground mycelium networks can redistribute minerals around the field is such a fascinating idea. I'm going to hypothesize that doesn't apply if they just keep plowing the field every year, because they just want to break it up.
Yeah.
So maybe in forests or maybe in permaculture places, that's probably where that really comes into its own, I think.
Mm-hmm. It goes to show the intelligence of nature.
It does, yeah. Yeah. And it makes sense, because you're not, everything isn't going to land evenly on the field out of the air. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So that somehow there has to be some way to redistribute it. But what was the point I was making? We got onto that from talking about nutrient density.
Mm-hmm. And the minerals.
And the minerals.
Levels of nutrients within.
So there's I think there's two main reasons why food today is not as nutrient dense as it used to be. And one of them is the farming practice, like you just said. It's like the soil or the mycorrhiza, whatever the reason. But ultimately, whatever the reason is, it is the issue. The issue is that the plants are not taking it up. But there's also another reason, which is that we've selectively bred the certain plants for certain characteristics. Like apples have been bred to be sweeter. And there's fantastic comparisons, like fantastically amazing differences if you compare old style crab apples, which were the original eating apples, sour, nice in their own way, but kind of sour and smaller, to the modern Granny Smith. And it's literally 100 times different. Yeah. If they juice them and they measure the phytochemicals and the micro minerals, it's it could be 100 times different. It's one is almost non-existent and the other was going to give you all the nutrients you needed to drive your brain. It was amazing difference. And that's throughout the system. So we've created different wheat, even the grass.
Genetically modified. GMOs.
Yeah, and the GMO, yeah, and the GMOs, like, that's even to do with like pest resistance and stuff like that. But yeah, but even outside of GMO, just the breeding, just interbreeding of plants without using GMO, it's kind of like long-term GMO, you might call it. We're selecting for certain characteristics that humans like. So even the wheat to make the flour, like, the driver could be like, what's the texture of the flour to make the nice bread? We better change the wheat kernel to suit that. And that's higher gluten, actually. In fact, that's one of the reasons we have a lot of gluten in our diet. So gluten is just this protein that's in the plant, isn't it? It's just a simple protein in the plant, but it gives it this kind of...
Einkorn, am I right in saying it's einkorn is the older
one,
grain? Yeah, that was far less.
That's right, yeah.
Glutinous,
Yeah, einkorn and emmer, I think. Emmer wheat, yeah. They have less gluten in them. I think they have a slightly different gluten molecule, but it's still gluten.
Mm-hmm.
They have less in it, which means that the bread isn't as like fluffy and stretchy or whatever. So, you know, that was a modern... You could call it a benefit if you like, because it's nice, but it's a different gluten. But
well, interestingly, a lot of people that talk about when they eat bread, will say in the States versus coming to Europe and having bread, if they're, let's say, on a trip through Italy, they don't suffer from a lot of the, especially digestive issues.
Yeah, because
of that reason, that there's a very different wheat source.
I only had that conversation last week with my cousin, Tara. Who's a nutritionist. She moved over from America, and the gluten doesn't, whatever, the wheat, whether it's gluten or not, I'm not sure, but the wheat doesn't affect her as much over here as it does over there. Just only a few days ago. That's funny, but it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. So the nutrient density is it's like a consequence of how we're farming, but B, it's a consequence of decisions we've deliberately made to favor typically more sweetness or in some cases texture over what the original was. I kind of find it hard, like, I kind of find it hard to judge that, because you'd kind of do it if you could, you know, but it's everywhere now. And so you have to be, this ties back into your kind of self-awareness. You have to be aware that that's a problem, and that if you're eating it every day and you're intolerant to it, it's a problem. And if you're trying to solve a problem against the clock, like infertility, it's just a problem, because it's everywhere. You have to consciously navigate your way through the current food supply of the world. You have to do it. Otherwise, you just end up like everybody else, or you end up the same as you are, in the sense you're not changing anything. And so you're just going to have to keep having the same problems. Mm-hmm. The only way that argument I just made there doesn't make any sense is if you don't believe that the food is driving your problem. If you don't believe that, fine. Then, you know, solve it with drugs. But it is driving it, because the foundation isn't there anymore. And even like, even if you think I'm making too strong an argument for nutrition because I'm biased or something, the simplest way to think about it is that if you even get your nutrition sort of half right in comparison to whatever it was, it may not be enough to solve your problem, but it will make it easier for anything else you do, whether that's, you know, acupuncture or drugs.
It's a great starting point.
It's a great starting point. It'll make it easier for those other things to help you get over the line. And my argument is the closer you get to your version of like what's optimal for you, you're probably going to get over the line. But if you don't, it's going to be easier to get over the line with whatever else, you know, whatever else. You might need surgery, you might need IVF, you might need Clomid, you might need whatever. You might need diabetic drugs, but it'll be easier to get over the line if the foundation is stronger, because even the drugs will work better.
Yeah. So we're basically looking at if you're not eating properly, if you're not sleeping properly, if you're not pooping properly, and your blood sugar is an absolute mess, your health is just, including your fertility, is at risk. Yeah. So addressing those initially, getting those right, is the best bedrock you can have for your fertility. And after that, if you still have to address issues, then you can look at things like toxin load. Yes. So when we look at something like toxin load, especially when it comes to fertility, you're looking at how susceptible an egg would be, or sperm for the man as well, to toxins. So when we're talking about toxins, we're looking at whether it's environmental toxins, those things that are around us, exogenous. We're looking at the endogenous, so ones that are created within your body. Yeah. like a byproduct of something going on. So if there's, if you're not losing your hormones from the body after you use them, so in other words, the use it and lose it, kind of get rid of it from your pee, your sweat, breathe it out, or, poop it out.
Yeah.
If that's not happening, we're going to address those as well. But we have to start somewhere. And as you say, it may be like a pyramid. So you've got to start with the basics and work your way then. And you'll find your solutions then.
There's a lot in everything you said there. So the toxins is a big one. But just to go back to your sort of short list of what would you look at first?
Eating, sleeping, pooping, and blood sugars.
Yeah. And I kind of, in a way, I'd single out sleeping there and say, and I'm speaking here as a former insomniac. I think it went on for like 20 years. That was a long time. But I'll just...
just before you go on, I need to give credit where credit is due for that. That's the basics, that the non-negotiables that Andrea Nakayama talks about, functional nutritionists. So she would say they're the non-negotiables for anyone's health across the board. When you're talking about chronic illness or, addressing health issues, it is those fundamentals that you need to have in place. So they're the,
eating, sleeping, pooping, and toxins.
Yeah. If you're not eating well, sleeping. Well, hydrating would include hydrating in that.
Okay.
So eating and hydrating.
Yeah.
Sleeping, pooping, and if your blood sugar is just complete nightmare.
So the good news with the blood sugar is it's relatively easy to measure, but you can have blood sugar problems even though your doctor's test is showing that your blood sugar looks okay. There's a few different measurements you can take, and actually you can get quite advanced on that, and kind of goes beyond, like, gets into a kind of a fairly specific conversation. But
the basic one that most people would see on a report would be the blood glucose, so your fasting blood glucose. But we want to go beyond that, and we want to have a look at something like the HbA1c, which is a measure of your blood glucose over an average of about 90 days or thereabouts. But ideally, we'd want to see a fasting insulin and see what that's doing.
That's the one thing that nobody does.
Can't get anybody to do it.
Can't get anyone to do it.
Yeah. And how simple would it be to pinpoint that very early on?
Yeah.
In someone's journey and say, actually, your insulin levels are really gone too sky high, because the insulin levels will be up way, way, way before you're going to see it on fasting blood sugar. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the logic behind that is, like, if you're constantly eating too much sugar for your body, your insulin will have to, your body, your pancreas will have to keep producing insulin in order to sort of drive, in order for you to do something with the blood sugar. You drive it out of your blood into your cells. You store it. You tend to store it as fat. So over time, if you keep eating high sugar food, which includes bread, biscuits, buns, scones, and sugar, and obvious sugar, but as well as non-obvious sugar, carbohydrates, like simple carbohydrates, let me qualify that for a second. If you're eating the sugar without eating the micro minerals and the nutrients, micronutrients that would have normally been in the food, but were stripped out to make the sweet food that your insulin, your blood sugar will elevate every time you eat.
So what you're basically saying there is, rather than having the whole grain that would have been there with its husk and everything else around it, and the other minerals that came right under that husk, that's been stripped away in order to make a much finer product, which is much wider and much faster delivery of the energy from that molecule or component, and it goes into the bloodstream much quicker. And there's that spike then in blood glucose. Yeah,
exactly. That's exactly it. And on top of that, you haven't eaten the nutrients that would have been with it. So now you've got to go and use the nutrients that you ate from some other food to help you deal with this particular sugar.
So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul.
So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you're depleting yourself. And that includes, like, B vitamins and magnesium. So it's not just minerals, it's vitamins and minerals. And the B vitamins in particular are famous for being the very thing that the mitochondria need to drive the entire machinery of making the energy.
Along with that CoQ10 that you mentioned
along
earlier,
with the CoQ10
in that electron transport
and the iron and the magnesium and the zinc. And I mean, they're kind of all used, but there are certain key ones that the biochemists have figured out are like the most important. And you're stripping them out. So processed food strips them out. And so now you're eating food that's going to drive your blood sugar up, which is a problem. If you keep driving your blood sugar up, you will end up with an inflamed blood, like, vascular system. and you'd end up with an inflamed brain because like, okay, I won't.
Brain is highly vascularized.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
when we're talking about vascularized, we're talking about all that blood transportation system. So
Yeah.
the inner lining,
Exactly.
the endothelial lining.
Endothelial membrane is inflamed.
Yeah.
But just to kind of connect the full circle here, I kind of started off by saying that if you boil down all of these problems, it comes down to unstable energy. There's a classic example of it there. So you're eating lots of fuel in this case, the sugar in whatever the food is, like white flour or just sugar, whatever it is, and it's flowing through your blood vessels. Well, those cells that it's literally bumping up against will be supplied with that sugar, and that's a lot of fuel without the nutrients. And so it's those cells whose energy system is imbalanced. So what you're seeing when you're seeing inflamed blood vessels, what you're really seeing is the cells that line the blood vessels, the actual blood vessels themselves, are struggling to cope with the amount of fuel, and their energy system is now become erratic and unstable. And it's the erratic, unstable energy system that's actually causing the problem.
So they're overfed but undernourished.
And they don't have the right nutrients. They don't have enough nutrients to process the amount of fuel you just gave them. And
this is where we start to get to a state with a lot of people who become insulin resistant.
yeah,
And what does that mean? That's basically when the cells are then just saying, look, we can't take this anymore.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
And this is where somebody may start to see that pre-diabetic signs and symptoms.
that's it, yeah.
And then from there, with the rise in the blood sugar levels or fasting blood glucose levels, they may then be warned by a doctor, that you've got to get this under control or you're going to wind up on insulin. Unfortunately, they're given insulin or metformin or something like that. So it's a vicious circle then.
It's a vicious circle. I was going to say it's hard to break, but it's not actually like complicated to break. You have to stop. You have to eat a low carb food for a while. You have to go onto a low carb diet to take the carbs out of your system and give your body the low carb food that has the micronutrients. The distinction is that the fuel that we're talking about, the carbohydrates, is the sort of the big nutrient, the macronutrient, whereas the micronutrients are the vitamins and minerals. That's the thing that's missing. Mm-hmm. And that's the key to the whole thing. They're like the keys for the lock or whatever. And so you need lots of them. And without them, you're now processing the fuel inefficiently, and it's kind of spilling out and it's gone on fire outside. A car is even the wrong analogy to use here. It's too simple an analogy to use. But it's actually back to smoke and mitochondria. It's like the mitochondria are like, if you imagine them as factories producing lovely, clean, stable energy, but all of a sudden they get dumped with loads of fuel, but they don't have the micronutrients to sort of activate the machinery that processes it. Well, all of a sudden the smoke from starts to come out the chimney stacks, and it's the mitochondria are smoking.
Reactive oxygen species.
That's it.
They set off their alarm system at that stage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the analogy of the smoke is essentially oxidative stress, or reactive oxygen species, or like free radicals.
And people may know about free radicals, and this is where the whole idea of taking some antioxidants come in.
Yeah.
That this is just for listeners then, that they will at least understand that these are molecules that we're trying to fight all the time then with these
exactly. Yeah.
antioxidants. And we must say though that the body produces its own antioxidants, that we're not necessarily saying that you have to take them in supplemental form, but your body will produce some,
It's one of the things it's one of the things that'll help you a bit if you're in that state and you have the smoking mitochondria. Your mitochondria are like struggling to produce stable energy, so they're leaking all this sort of. You could think of it as like a toxic sort of a substance, but it's a natural substance of free radicals, and they essentially kind of burn is actually a good word to use. It's like technically, chemically speaking, it's kind of like a chemical burn. They burn the mitochondria, which makes them less efficient and more likely to produce more free radicals, which burns them even further, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And so what did I just say there, by the way, in case you think I'm like gone into the deep end of chemistry? It's like if you eat high sugar foods regularly, you'll inflame your body because you're not eating the micronutrients that help your body to process the sugar. And the result of that is these free radicals, and then this thing I mentioned earlier, inflammation, which is, they're kind of linked but they're different. but they're kind of go hand in hand. And it's you can kind of think of it as like a fire in the body, and the body then has to try and put out the fire, and it's putting it out with these antioxidants. But it's only got so many, and they rely on nutrients. You can't make the antioxidants without all the nutrients. So if you're short of the nutrients, not only are you causing more fire in the body, but you're making less firemen. And that's a vicious cycle. But I think that's the cycle that most people are in.
Yeah.
So it's obvious in extreme cases, in hospital cases like sepsis, and it's obvious in those cases. It's just not obvious in most of us because we're walking kind of wounded. But it's a fact. Like a lot of people that have any sort of metabolic issue, any condition.
Walking around with fatigue. Malaise, a general malaise.
Yeah, all that stuff is the thing, is the symptom of this, and that's common. I actually, earlier you were talking about Andrea's thing and the sleep. I want to single out the sleep for a minute, because A, it is very important, but B, I'll just give you my own experience on it. Some people have bad sleep habits. So let's say they go to bed late, or whatever, right? Or they sleep in a noisy or lit up environment, whatever. That kind of stuff. And that affects their sleep. Or their partner snores or something. So it's a direct effect on their sleep. Yes, you have to solve that. But in my case, I tried everything to solve it. And this is where it gets a bit of a circular argument. For me, I had to fix my food before the insomnia went away. So it's like, if you say, oh, you have to get your sleep right before you can be healthy, I'm saying, yes, that's true, but sometimes your food is causing the sleep problem.
Yeah.
And so you have to get your food right first. So it's always food first with me. It was a dramatic experience for me. And
food and the blood sugar. The blood sugar in terms of if you're, let's say, somebody who is on that blood sugar roller coaster, as we would refer to it in our practice as. So if somebody is spiking their blood sugar and then the insulin is being pumped out throughout the day and they're having these drops then and very low energy and they need another pick-me-up, so they just keep reaching for more sugary or higher carb foods or high fat foods and things like that, then by the time they get during the night, when they may have gotten off to sleep, but they may wake up because their body all of a sudden they've gone hypoglycemic. In other words, their blood sugar has dropped so low that their brain has woken them up to say there's an emergency here.
Exactly.
So they wake up and there's this state of adrenaline, cortisol, a pump out of more of the blood glucose to try and fuel the brain once more. So there are people there that are actually having hypos in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
So we are coming back to looking at the same things again. We're looking at the nutrients coming in. We're looking at the taking control of the level of high carb foods, bringing it back down, having adequate fats in the diet, protein and everything else to stabilize the blood sugar.
Yeah, that's probably like the most common problem. I'd say if you... So I've been making the argument that like the lack of the micronutrients is the big problem, but on a more understandable level, it's like I think the main problem with people is they're eating too much of the high carb food, and exactly what you're saying is happening. Eventually, they're running out of the ability to buffer that system with insulin, and there's several other hormones too, but insulin is a famous one. And so they need micronutrients to do that. And if they're short, then that starts to malfunction. And the malfunction is slow but gradual. Like if diabetes is the ultimate